Very excited today to have Michelle Phoenix, Dr. Michelle Phoenix, Dr. Sam Micsinszki, and Dr. Gail Teachman with us to talk about their work, particularly in bringing vulnerable population and marginalized voice into research and in health research. So Michelle and Sam are both involved in McMaster's Code Design Hub, and they've been using really creative approaches in bringing particularly parents of children with disability into research. So we'll start with their presentation, and I think in between we'll have 5 minutes for Q&A when Gail set up her presentation. And then Gail will be talking about engaging children with disabilities in research. So I will let Michelle take over the stage and tell us more about her work.
Thank you, Elaine, and it's so nice to see familiar faces on the line. I hope everybody's doing well. My name's Michelle Phoenix. Oh. Before I get into introductions, let me walk you through our agenda. So we will do introductions just quickly because I know that we have 3 of us presenting or co-presenting today and wanted to save time for discussion. We'll go briefly through what does child and family engagement in research mean? Why might you consider engaging families in your research? How can you engage families in research, and the co-design hub and the work that we are doing there? It's quite an ambitious agenda for a half hour or 25 minutes. So if there's anything that you'd like to follow up with either Sam or I about, please feel free to do so. Our contact information was on the first slide. So for our introductions, we were hoping that you could tell us in the chat a little bit about who's on the line. We always have a lovely diverse group here at CCHCSP. So if you don't mind popping in the population that you work with, the environment in which you conduct most of your research, and just for fun, whether you prefer cats or dogs or other. We've had bunnies pop up in the chat before. Thanks, Jennifer. Oh, what a good variety of environments that we're getting through. Not surprising to see a lot of pediatric populations and some diagnoses coming through there as well. Some adolescents, thank you. The NICU. And a lot of dog lovers. Oh, I see a cat lover. Hi, Melissa. Oh, Janice is allergic to everything. More youth, some cystic fibrosis. Okay, thank you everybody. That's really helpful when we're thinking about how to tailor and contextualize the information that we're sharing today. I think that child and family engagement and research can occur in all of these sessions. It doesn't have to occur in any of these environments or research. And I think between our session and Gail's, you can think about whether or not it might be applicable to the kind of work that you do. Okay, so a little introduction to myself. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Rehabilitation Science in the speech-language pathology program. I also worked clinically as a speech-language pathologist with preschool-age children and their families for many years. My research is focused on the topics of attendance, engagement, and equity in children's rehabilitation services. And there's some themes around family-centered care, co-design in health and social service, models of service delivery, parent mental health, and what we're talking about today is really around patient engagement in research. I was a member of CCHCSP during my doctoral training. I should mention that as well. And Sam, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, so I am Sam Micsinszki. I'm a registered nurse and a postdoctoral fellow, and I have the privileged to be working with Michelle Phoenix for my postdoc at McMaster in the School of Rehab Sciences. And I'm also affiliated with CanChild and the Bloorview Research Institute. I am also very privileged to be able to be the course coordinator for the Family Engagement and Research course that's offered through McMaster, Continuing Education, which is funded by Kids Brain Health Network and CanChild for the upcoming cohorts. My PhD was in sleep in parents of children with ASD at the University of Toronto. And for my postdoc, I'm really interested in patient engagement, especially for those who may face additional barriers to inclusion. And that's why I'm working with Michelle, and I'm really excited to be here.
Great. So over to you, Sam. Sorry.
No, that's okay. Thanks, Michelle. So I'm going to be just giving a little bit of an overview. What does child and family engagement mean? So next slide. So we are hoping to get your thoughts around what you think or what child and family engagement means to you. So you could use the chat, or you could raise your hand to offer either terms that you've heard or ways you define community engaged research. And we'll just take a few minutes just to get oriented to where we're starting from. So yes, nothing about us without us. Yes, it's a very popular slogan that often comes to mind when doing this work. Elaine says, researching on topics that originates from the community and using methodologies that engages the community. Having patients or family members on the steering committee for research as co-investigators, family engagement.
呢個興㗎，就可能有時間開估啊。哦，咪 always make sure。Is
there a way to mute?
分開咗咩 open 咗知唔知啊？
Getting some feedback, so please don't forget to mute yourself.
哦，我哋啲開啲係難啲嘅啫，我而家開。
Linda, can you do a mute for us?
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So thank you so much for providing your the terms that you've heard, and I think that's exactly what we're getting at today. So we're going to move into the next slides. So just some key terms that you might have seen or come across. So there's CHR uses citizen engagement often, or patient engagement. You might see strategy for patient-oriented research, or just POR, public and patient engagement, or you might see public involvement. And there are a lot of different terms in the literature that what we're describing and what you had presented in the chat around this idea of involving children and families in their research. And there are a lot of nuances and definitions out there. As you can see, all these organizations have their own definitions of what it means to them and what it looks like. Generally speaking, I think we're all thinking about this idea of having patients and families on research and being able to provide collaboration in a meaningful way. So next slide, Michelle. So this idea is really moving from participant to partner. In previous involvement in research has often been restricted to this participant role, where as researchers, we're obtaining or collecting data from participants who have lived experience of some kind of condition or disease. And we're seeing this trend in health research. It's been kind of slow towards this movement of this passive participant to an active or collaborative role in research, in which persons with lived experience have been been involved in all aspects of the research, right from the very beginning of defining what the research questions and all the way throughout. And this might not be all the way throughout, so they might not be involved in every single component of the research, but their voice and their collaboration is within the team. So next slide, Michelle. So that brings us to the question, what is patient engagement? And this definition in this slide is from CHR's definition for patient engagement. And they talk about, and what we talk about patient engagement is this idea of meaningful collaboration, where patients become partners on a project and they're actively engaged in things like the governance of the research. They help develop the priorities, establish the research questions and drive those through, and even performing certain parts of the research itself. So even being part of data collection and data analysis. And so it's that idea of moving towards from passive to active in a meaningful way. Next slide. I think this is on you, Michelle.
Thank you. So we know that people might have varying levels of familiarity with this topic or actually having done patient-engaged research before. For people who are just starting to think about why you might engage families in research, we'll provide an overview. I'd love to do this as a discussion, but because of time, I'll walk you through a couple of the different reasons that you might want to consider patient-engaged research for family engagement in research. So for an ethical perspective, Gail dropped in the chat earlier, nothing about us without us. So do people have a right to be involved in setting the priorities for the research that might involve them or impact them in some way? There may be benefits to the people who participate in research. So youth might experience a building of their network, a building of communication skills, for example. Families often talk about the meaningfulness for them in giving back or paying it forward to the people who come after them and moving through a system or through research. There can be an impact on the research itself, so I'll walk through some of those in the next slide. But increasingly, we're seeing a requirement that's there with a question mark because some of the granting agencies are requiring you to have stakeholders or patient partners on your research team to be eligible for funding. And that's an ethical conundrum, I think. It might vary in the quality with which people are engaging these partners. It could be a tick box fashion just to be eligible without true and meaningful engagement, but we'll get to what does quality engagement look like in a minute. So the reported benefits of engaging families in research that I just alluded to might include higher enrollment in studies, improved retention rate in the studies, improved dissemination, and then the value of co-learning. There's a thought that it can create better research by sharing the experience or including the experiences of people with lived experience. The benefits for the partners might also include the meaningful work and the improved communication skills. It's not all about the benefits. I think it's important for us to be aware of reported risks or harms or challenges. There is a risk or a reported over representation of what we call super users. So people who might have a role in patient engagement, maybe they're hired on or they become well known in a community and they are tapped for a lot of different projects and become very familiar with the system and with the research sort of enterprise and perhaps a little bit farther from their own lived experience and starting to maybe speak to the experience that other people might have that they haven't had themselves, and are we asking people to do that? I think it's an important question. There can be a difference in the expectations and roles that people have of themselves or others. So what does it mean to include youth, for example, on your research team, and do the youth agree about the ways in which they might want to be included? Funding is a challenge, especially if you want to include people at the outset of a project. When you're developing the ideas and the proposal, you might not have funding in place to compensate the patient partners who are involved in your team at that point. And then administration support. Other challenges include the time, increased time that it takes to do this in a meaningful way, the funding to be able to do that. I mentioned tokenism earlier, and scope creep, I think, refers to the expectations and roles and what we're asking people to provide their insights on. Okay, so how can we engage families in research? There's underlying principles that I think should guide the work that we do in engaging youth or family members in the research that we do. These aren't the only set, it's a set that I like that's been developed by the Office of Community Engagement. They include reciprocity, so making sure that the benefit is to the population that you are engaging, not just to the research team. Equity and thinking about who we're including and how inclusive we are in our efforts to include them in the research. Continuity, so will there be a sustained relationship or sustained benefit for that community? Openness to learning, and I think that gets at the tokenism. If we are only inviting people in to agree with the ideas that we already have, that it creates a challenge in a tokenistic environment in which to do the work. Whereas if we can come in with some humility and the curiosity and a willingness to learn from the people that we are engaging, we're likely to see more benefit, and then a commitment to act. So are we ending at a publication or an academic presentation, or are we taking those next steps, let's say in knowledge translation, to ensure that there is change in the communities that we are working with? This is a tool that I like that looks at sort of tangibly how are we engaging our patient partners. So in the orange, you'll see the stage of the project, and across the top in blue, you can see a role in the project. So the roles go from almost a passive recipient, so you're giving information to your patient partner, right up to a highly active and sustained role in the project of a decision maker. So you might see that more in participatory action research. Yeah. Anyway, let's leave it at that, or community-based research, where you have a little bit more of a sharing of power, and you could even, the researchers can follow the lead of the community members that they are involved with. And it's not to say that one is better than the other. It's to help you think about what type of role is needed throughout the project. I'm just noticing the chat. Oh, thanks, Sam. There's a link in the chat to the matrix. This is a paper that I authored a couple of years ago, just because we were noticing there's a lot of parallels between people who do qualitative research and some of the philosophies and methods of doing patient-engaged research. It's not to say that you have to be a qualitative researcher to do patient-engaged work, or to say that you can only do patient-engaged work if you're doing qualitative research. But some of the parallels that we thought were this idea of a co-constructed flexible approach to research. So for example, if you're working with patient partners throughout the research process and they suggest something that is different than the original proposal that went in through ethics, do you have an opportunity to shape your research according to their ideas? In terms of sampling, and I talked about the super users earlier, in qualitative research, you often use a really targeted, purposeful approach to sampling. You might want to do that when you're choosing your patient partners as well. You might want to think about the purpose for engaging them and what sort of lived experience you are looking for, and then do a targeted ask. And then finally, the methods of doing patient-engaged research. They might include focus groups or interviews, surveys, for example, that are commonly used in qualitative research, but can also be used to engage people as partners in your research. I won't go through each of these. I just wanted you to have the reference there and available. Black has done some work around creating meaningful engagement with patients and partners, as families, as partners on the research team, and goes through things that you can do in the research environment. I mentioned expectations earlier, the support that might be needed, and then the value as well. Sam, I'll pass it to you.
Thanks, Michelle. So I'm going to just briefly dip into what we do at the Co-Design Hub, which is a major part of my postdoc work. Next slide. Thanks, Michelle. So the Co-Design Hub is a 3-year multidisciplinary initiative, and our focus is on creating health and social service system change with structurally vulnerable populations. And we really do this by bringing together an interdisciplinary group of researchers, students, service providers, service users, so people within the community, to create this virtual and physical Co-Design Hub space. And we have such a great group of interdisciplinary researchers, trainees, community stakeholders on our hub team. And they are from a variety of different disciplines across health and rehab, but also includes engineering, business, critical disability studies, and design, both within and beyond our McMaster community. Next slide, Michelle. So you might be thinking, how does the Co-Design Hub facilitate this? How do we do this? So we do this through 3 overlapping focus within engagement, education, and innovation. And I'm going to just tell you a very little bit about how we do this and some of the activities that we do to engage and innovate and educate. So through engagement, we have monthly team meetings, which is pretty typical for teams, but we also have 2 community representatives. So we have a family member and a service user, and they are invited on all our team meetings. And then we also engage them within the hub activities. We've hosted 2 co-design cafes, and these cafes have been virtual discussions, and they have included our co-design hub team, but also include a range of community stakeholders. And the purpose of these cafes was to inform the strategic directions of the hub. So what do we want to see the hub doing, and how are we going to get there? And this is really driven by the need and the wants of the community. So it's really driving the focus on where we're going in the future. In terms of engagement, we also have a website and a social media profile on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And we do a lot of partnership exploration and partnership and collaboration within our Co-Design Hub team. And we have regular connections with our Office of Community Engagement. In terms of education, we host they're pretty monthly speaker series. Most months we have a speaker series. We also host workshops, and we have videos on our website. We also have publications. And the idea behind this driving focus is to provide education and training about co-design, but also that it's free and open to members of the McMaster community and also beyond. And with COVID, we've had really good success moving online and having international attendees at our workshops and our speaker series. Lastly, through innovation, we collaborate with other McMaster researchers, and this includes things like submitting grants that might be led by other researchers, but have our co-investigators on their teams through a wide range of projects. So we're not specific to one like health research or children. We really go across the lifespan and through a variety of different project areas. We have an innovation grant, which we funded 3 $5,000 McMaster student projects. And the call just came out this week for our most recent one. And then lastly, we also have 2 overarching sort of programs of research. So one is a multi-site realist evaluation that is across several case study sites. And the second is a developmental evaluation, which is of our work. And those co-design cafes are part of that developmental evaluation work. And that work is leading to our theory of change. Next slide. So this image on the right.
Sorry, Sam, I'm just wondering, in the interest of time, if we leave this slide for people to review on their own and follow up. I want to make sure that there's enough time for discussion, and I want to leave Gail enough time as well.
Yes, definitely. Thanks, Michelle, for keeping me on time. So we'll move. These 2 are publications, and you can go through them on your own time. And then the last bit is just around resources and how you can connect with us. So if you move to the next slide, Michelle, it is our Co-Design Hub website. And I will post some links in the chat And this is how you can get connected with us. You can either email us or go on our website. We also have a mailing list that talks about all these exciting events, such as our speaker series and our workshops. And we're also pretty active on Twitter. Next slide. And the last one is just a plug for our family engagement and research course, which will be coming up for the fall and winter cohorts. And the deadline is June 16th. And just some additional resources.
The other opportunity to connect and do some training around meaningful engagement in research is a simulation training opportunity that Sam and I will be running out of Holland Bloorview Kids Rehabilitation Center in June, and it's free. So if anybody is interested in these topics and further wanting to develop their skill set, we're recruiting now, and we can drop the link into the chat for you. So Elaine, does that leave us time for a couple of questions?
Yes, so if you have any questions, feel free to type it into chat or unmute yourself and ask the question. I think we'll let Gail pull up her presentation and while we answer some questions.
Thank you, Derek, for the additional examples in the chat. Sorry, there was a question.
No, I said I can ask a question to get us started. This came from my own experience engaging with partners in research. And I think one of the things that we notice is sometimes in the partnership process during the research, you might want to change something in your methodology. And I wonder if Michelle and Sam, you can speak to how you work with ethics so that they can be flexible enough for you to make changes in your ethics in the middle of the project.
We're dealing with this right now, Elaine. Some of our feedback from our patient partners was that our consent form was too overwhelming for our patient population, which in this case was women experiencing homelessness. And so we've moved to a virtual consent form and also changed our interview guide pretty significantly. But I think you just have to build in time, knowing that there's likely to be changes needed, and then work with your ethics boards through amendments to accommodate for the changes.
That's definitely something I didn't consider when I first jumped into engagement research, was the time piece in the research process.
Really does take a lot of time, and I find in academia we have really weird timelines where you wait for a long time for things to happen, like for grant review, and then there's like this flurry of really rapid activity, and knowing that our patient partners don't work on the same timelines as we do, I think is really helpful.
Are there any other questions for Michelle and Sam? All right, so maybe we'll let Gail get started with her presentation and we'll have some more time for questions at the end.
Great, thanks. Yeah, feel free to, I would like to talk maybe at the most about 20 minutes. So I'll keep track of time myself, but Elaine, feel free to tell me if we're getting past that, because again, I'd like to have time for discussion at the end, both of what I'm presenting, but also perhaps how our presentations complement each other. And I hope that will become apparent as we go along. So just a couple of words about myself. I am an OT by discipline and practiced for a long time in a clinical role, gradually taking on more and more research. I worked both in Canada and in the United States. So I had quite a lot of exposure to many different types of occupational therapy, although most of my work was with young people with impairments, illness, disability, and their families, of course. I think that most healthcare professionals would agree with me that we learn a tremendous amount from the people that we work with. I became more and more aware of that over time, but I wasn't sure that this kind of learning was always a match with the sorts of things that we continue to teach in terms of training healthcare professionals and also some of the common practices, especially when it comes to things like what can we learn from young people and families about living well with chronic illness, with disability, with impairment. Because we are trained in quite problem or deficit-oriented approaches, sometimes it's difficult to get past those kinds of ways of thinking about our practice. One of the things that also really set me in terms of particular interest in this project was research I did while I was still working clinically. We wanted to talk to teachers in schools, young people with disabilities, and families about what it meant to collaborate in a team. So very close to the idea of partnership that we're talking about today. And I won't share much about that research, except that one young man who participated in that research said to me, oh yeah, collaboration means I get to go to the meeting about my progress at school and listen to a lot of adults talk around a table. And he was not being coy. And there were things like that that really made me stop and think. Sometimes we're quite quick to feel as though we're including people or we're collaborating, but we're not aware of the extent to which we're still very much driving the process and where people may not feel an opportunity to fully participate. So this presentation is specifically focusing on what might be some of the tensions, what are some of the ethical things that we may need to think a bit more deeply about as we try to do this patient-oriented research or talk about partnering with young people and families. So I would say I'm absolutely keen that we should partner with young people. I just think that there's a lot for us to think about carefully in terms of the tensions and ethics that might be involved. So this is a project where we are very much doing this idea of partnering, but at the same time, we're trying to learn about young people's moral experiences in the context of partnering, primarily with adults in research and governance. And just briefly, the logos at the top represent the 3 different groups that are funding this work. So I've already said a little bit about the context and background, and just to emphasize, in a way, I think that for me, I hope that you find that what I'm talking about is complementary to the first presentation, in the sense that it's about just going a little bit deeper and trying to ask some very difficult questions, some of which have already been alluded to in the first presentation. I'm going to tell you just a little bit about our project, but not focus too much on that. And as I said, I want to leave time for some discussions and dialogue about these ideas. So earlier we heard some definitions of patient engagement. What is it really? And this is an important question, but it is one for which there are so many different definitions, and that's already been highlighted. And why does that matter? Because it's important for us to recognize that, especially from the point of view of the people that we are trying to work together with, like families, young people, they may have a very different idea about what this means. Just as the example I gave you about what does collaboration mean, we got very different answers from different groups when we asked those questions and considered other people's perspectives on the work. Here are some definitions. Again, these are similar to what was shared. These are pretty standard types of definitions, one from the Canadian Foundation for Healthcare Improvement, one from Health Quality Ontario. Things like, these are initiatives that engage patients and families in designing, delivering, and evaluating health services with the goal of improving the quality of care. Patients, families, and health providers actively collaborating, so there's that word again, in improving Ontario's health system. So these might be what we're aiming for sure, but they're not the only way that people have talked about patient engagement. And I think many of us are not aware that there have also been many, many critiques of patient engagement and some of the ways that it is enacted. So it's important, I think, for us to also kind of, if we thought about patient engagement as a building, perhaps it's important to think about, we want to walk all around that building because there are going to be different perspectives, different points of view on that building they're not all the same as the front-facing, sort of very positive view that we have of patient engagement. We need to be mindful that we might be idealizing some of these ways of working together, not fully aware of what some of the various power relations are, or questions that we need to be asking. And even go to the point of saying, like, which parts are ideology, new ideas that are being heavily promoted right now. Again, I like the idea very much of patient engagement. I think there's a tremendous amount for us to learn, but I think we need to be very careful that we're not just jumping on a bandwagon, hoping that we're doing this in a way that is beneficial. So again, these might be thought of as somewhat idealized framings of patient engagement. I won't read them out loud in terms of the time we have today, but again, these are aims, a constructive dialogue, reshaping relationships, having a say. And one of the earlier definitions in the first presentation, this idea of meaningful partnerships and participation. But again, what is meaningful, and from whose point of view is it meaningful? What is constructive dialogue? What are the ways that someone could be involved and feel that their involvement in a project ended up having impact, that they could see that their involvement made a difference? There's actually a fair bit of literature and also lots of patient and client or public-facing critique of patient engagement, which we won't go into today, but I can point you in that direction if some of you are interested. I think it is important to know what has been talked about where things are not working so well, and so therefore, what can we learn from that? So here's one that says, but maybe patient engagement is an institutional response designed to address a legitimacy crisis, bolster managerial power, and/or satisfy external pressures through tokenistic practices of engagement. That might sound incredibly critical. However, we do know that it would be pretty easy to be tokenistic, and that's one of the chief complaints about the ways that patient engagement is sometimes taken up. There is a term, virtue signaling, that has been getting a lot of attention during COVID in terms of things like claiming allyship as an example, without really having an understanding of what that means. But there is a risk that things like patient engagement activities could also take on some of that tone of signaling we're doing the right thing, feeling we're doing the right thing, but not taking the time to really be evaluating what is happening when we're doing what we call patient engagement. So here are some of the reasons that I would suggest we need to continue to critique the ideal of patient engagement, even as, like myself, I am going forward, working at trying to develop ways that are equitable to be engaging in patient engagement. So a good one that I like, not because I have an answer, but because I think it's a great question to ask. What is the problem for which patient engagement is meant to be the answer? I've already learned from many young people in the study that we're conducting that they often have participated in the past in projects where they weren't really sure what it was that they were meant to be contributing, or what it was that was the problem for the reason behind their involvement, the invitation to be part of the research. So most focus was placed on the research problem itself, but not so much on why would it be problematic to not include young people. So they're not sure why their participation is being requested. And again, so then what actually counts as patient engagement? More specifically, what are the aims and what are the terms of engagement? So for me, this is where we get into that ethical piece. There's lots that we could talk about, but for example, who benefits? And is there any kind of equity in terms of who benefits as opposed to who might experience potential harms? Are the benefits weighed in any type of equal relationship, or is it primarily the researchers and the institution who stand to gain? And what is at stake? I think there's been not nearly enough attention paid to what might be at stake for the people that we are asking to be involved in our work and to share their knowledge, their experiences, and their opinions. So again, it's simply just reminding ourselves that we want to be careful that we're not putting the cart before the horse, that we are thinking about these things, even as we do go forward with the idea of trying to work together with and partner with young people and families, or whoever it is that is participating in your research. Paula Rowland is someone, I believe she's still associated with St. Michael's in Toronto. She's done some beautiful work in this area. I just think that of her work, here's one powerful quote: "Given the time, commitment, and generosity involved in patient engagement efforts in organizations, we suggest that there is an ethical obligation to give those programs such careful thought." So in a way, this is one potential answer to why critique patient engagement. Why should we take the time to think about what's really going on and whether or not there could be any potential harms or effects that we're not aware of? And another of my favorite quotes in terms of even ideas like research is an endeavor where we are trying to produce knowledge. When we work with patients, we're trying to co-produce knowledge, but every way of knowing contains its own moral trajectory. It always comes from somewhere and is based on a set of values and norms that may or may not be shared when we work together with young people and patients. So to me, there is a piece that involves this attention to values, norms, what's important to the people that are sharing their time with us, so that we can understand that the knowledge we co-produce also will be based on the different values and norms that people have embraced in their own lives. Again, for time, I won't go into reading this out loud, but I would direct you to, this is just one of many powerful, very moving examples that have been written by people who have had a fair bit of experience in being a patient who's engaged. So an engaged patient, or often called a patient advisor. This is an award-winning dissertation from Zsuzsanna Waronka, who spent many years involved in mental health advisory roles. However, writes quite passionately about the toll, the cost to her. So it speaks to this issue of who is benefiting and what is at stake for the people that we are asking. Again, this is someone who has been able to document these kinds of effects and speak quite eloquently about them. I'm just mindful that not everyone that we invite to be part of research will be able to express these things. So we may need to accept responsibility ourselves for asking about whether or not people are having some of these sorts of feelings, whether they're feeling any sense of loss or as if they're giving away valuable knowledge and not being listened to. So again, here are, just to repeat, some of the important critical questions that we can be asking as we go forward. Whose initiative is it? And here I'm not talking so much about who sets the research question, which is important and it's already been talked about today, but whose initiative is this idea of patient engagement within a particular project or in a broader sense? What is being achieved and who benefits, which I've spoken to. And then again, how can we go further to accept responsibility in terms of identifying whether there are risks and potential harms? And actually, there is information telling us that that is possibility. So how will we plan ahead to ameliorate those types of risks and harms? Again, we could go into a bit more depth with thinking about things like whose initiative is this, who sets the agenda, who frames the questions, who makes decisions, who sets the terms, whose rules, very importantly, whose turf. There's a lot of people today in this session And I'm sorry, we're not seeing each other in person, so it's harder for me to even follow things like your body language or your nodding. But I think that for many of us, it's clear that the answer to many of these questions, perhaps not all, but the answer to many of these questions in many patient engagement activities is, it's the researcher or it's the institution who is doing these things. And that doesn't quite sit right. So I think we have to think about how that could be different. And it certainly won't be easy. I think it will be a journey to try to think about how we can shift some of these things. How can we shift the terms under which patient engagement occurs? How can we think differently? Now, COVID has provided us an opportunity to think about the turf on which this occurs. However, in the past, almost all patient engagement activities involved the patient going to the institution to attend meetings of some sort to contribute their perspective. But that automatically excludes certain people who might not be able to do that or don't have the time to do that and so on. So let's get into a little further, like, so what could there be in the way of potential harms? That's a very large topic. I've alluded to it a little, but I think some of it is things we know in terms of how exhausting it can be for people to continue to revisit traumatic times in their lives, to talk continually about what hasn't gone well for them, and to try to educate people about issues that have been, again, traumatizing or difficult or challenging for them. It will depend on the type of research, but I think that we underestimate the kind of energy and challenge that it can be for many people to speak up when they're in a relationship with researchers who, as much as we may try to do things like balance the power relations, we cannot get away from the fact that we are in very privileged positions with high levels of education. And these are the things that can make it really difficult and draining for somebody to continually be sharing their experience. So a certain amount of bravery and depletion over time can make patient advisors feel almost as if they're kind of being emptied out, but they're not sure, like, where is that benefit coming from? I think that, again, there are clear benefits, and I think that this is a journey and a task that is well worth taking. Not everyone agrees with that. So I think it's worth putting that out there. Some people do not think we should be engaged with these sorts of activities because there isn't enough equity. I hope that we can find ways to do this where there's a bit more mutual benefit, and where we have found ways to practice these things in quite ethical manners, where we're very open and mindful of the cost to the people that are working with us. Because I think otherwise we can't really follow this sort of guideline of nothing about us without us if we cannot find a way to do this in a more equitable manner. This is just, to point you in the direction of, here's one of the many kinds of blogs and websites where patients themselves who have been engaged in patient engagement have blogged and recorded all sorts of information that we can really learn a lot from in terms of how patient engagement has worked well for them and how not so much. I mentioned already we need to be mindful of things like virtue signaling, the idea of people sharing their knowledge and ideas for free based on goodwill, but not knowing where that knowledge goes, how it might be taken up and used in ways that they were not intending. To some extent, people might end up feeling that they're being used for something like market or customer research. That sounds a bit foreign, I'm sure. In healthcare, we wouldn't want to think that we're doing that, but in many cases, it's not so different than what people do in business and call market research. So we need to be mindful of how our patient advisors may perceive the sorts of relationships we're asking for. is there any risk that by engaging with patients, it's having an effect that kind of silences or manages complaints? It puts them into sort of an acceptable way of thinking about how to respond to an institution. I'm quite mindful, as an example, that some, certainly not all, training programs for people who want to become patient advisors may inadvertently train people about what is okay to say, how can they say it, how to talk in the ways that we talk as healthcare professionals. And it doesn't leave space for less so-called acceptable ways of talking about experiences. Again, is there just an illusion that the person's input is having influence, or can people who are involved with us clearly see a substantive difference in the work because of their involvement? Then another big issue, it's going to be one I think tough for all of us to tackle, is who is actually represented. Many times, without really paying attention, we think that patient engagement is somehow representing the voice of patients. We need to be very mindful for who actually, to this point at least, has participated in patient engagement. It's very, very often highly educated, white, middle to upper class people who can afford to do it in the way that it has been set up to this point. I've certainly heard from some of the young people involved in research with me that if they are a person of color, if they're a girl, if they're coming from poverty, they have definitely felt that their views were less listened to, that they were not asked to speak in public about their own experiences because they were not speaking in these more, again, acceptable, almost sort of professional ways. So there's a lot for us to think about, is who's represented and who has not really been invited to the table to this point when it comes to things like patient engagement. And I think, again, there were some good ideas in the first presentation about how we can think more carefully about whose expertise are we looking for, how can we balance some of that. And I'm sure Michelle and I could have a big conversation. It's definitely not easy to tackle, thinking about trying to recruit some sort of a broader sense of representation. So we have to continue to think outside the box. Okay, I've definitely gone past 20 minutes. I think I'll leave it there for now because I've given plenty for us to be thinking about. And I think what I'd also like to, if you don't mind, I'm sorry, I might skip forward a bit. That's our team and just a little bit about the study. You're all welcome if anyone would like to follow up with me about the actual study. I wasn't going to talk in much depth anyway, but I do want to just at least point out another great source for learning, both about all the potential possible benefits. Some of the things to think about would be this podcast, which is sponsored by Ontario's patient-oriented research group, Matters of Engagement. I've learned so much listening to this, and I've certainly done work in this area with Jennifer Johansson. And one of the key things that I wanted to leave with is just your thoughts on whether this is unsettling. Does any of it resonate? Does it feel too challenging to think about? Your thoughts around some of these things is where I hope that we might end. Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Gail. Again, we're going to open the floor up for questions. I can ask a question to get us started. Gail, you really speaks to the fact that I feel like I also don't stop enough in my research process to think about the risks and benefits. I wonder if you built in process during your own research planning and patients engagement so that you stop and ask questions like this.
Yeah, so in this project, as I said, we're trying to learn by doing. So the project has two parts. One, where we're working together with, we're calling the young people in the study our participant collaborators, working together with them to develop training modules for healthcare professionals that are focused on an idea called balancing the human aspects of care with the more physical aspects. So developing a training program where they're consulting. What do they think healthcare professionals need to know? At the same time, there's a second important piece right from the beginning where we're telling them that what we're interested in is learning how they're feeling about the way that they're being involved in the project, what's working well, what would they think we could change, how are they feeling in terms of whether they're being listened to, whether there is a safe space to be able to share, whether they do feel some of these things around kind of needing to speak in appropriate ways, whatever that means. So when the project, like one of the last stages, going to be working together in groups, plus a final kind of an exit interview to give young people as much opportunity as possible. And they're all, we will journal and they are journaling. Again, so trying to really keep that focus quite clearly on the ethics with a view to at least coming up with a provisional sense of like, what do these young people tell us could be some terms of engagement that we can bring forward as learning from the project.
I can also suggest, Elaine, that our co-design hub team engaged in developmental evaluation, and I don't know if that's familiar language to other people. It was new to me when we started this, but it involved an outside consultant who worked together with our team to keep asking critical questions of the work that we were doing. Some was around how we engage community members so that we could be flexible and dynamic in responding. So it wasn't just evaluating at the end and thinking, oh, we should have done X. It was being responsive in the moment to change what we were doing to engage people.
I was just pausing to see if anyone else wants to jump in for questioning. And again, I think I think what I've learned from engaging with partners is that constant check-in to make modification is so important. So I wonder if you can speak to in terms of how you budget time in projects in patient engagement research.
I'll go first. Michelle may also have something. It takes much longer. So that's already been mentioned, and I would absolutely emphasize that. It takes much, much longer. And I'm not sure that I've found any way around that yet. I think this idea of, really trying to develop what we would think of as a trusting partnership, it's quite a challenge. I'm not sure that I would even feel comfortable suggesting that we have managed that, but I think it would be, certainly this will be one of the questions we can ask toward the end of the project, because that would be in the view of the young people as far as I'm concerned. Have they felt that? I think that maybe I'll just turn over to you, Michelle, but yeah, time is huge. Sorry, the other thing was I feel fairly strongly that we need to budget. So we are paying quite a significant honorarium in this project. And that was kind of a basic condition that we set for ourselves if going forward with the work. So there's actually like an hourly remuneration. And again, I'm not trying to suggest, okay, that always has to be the case. There's so many different ways that we're working with young people, but I do think it's something we need to be very mindful of. We need to think carefully about how we value and show that we value the knowledge and time that people are contributing.
I don't know that I have an answer for you, Elaine. It's a constant challenge. I think the other constant challenge is around sustainability. So often our research goes for 3-year, 5-year terms, and to have people whose life stays stable enough for 3 to 5 years and their commitment can be maintained over that course of a project, I think that's really challenging, especially if you're working with people who have health conditions or their caregivers. They have a lot of demands in their life. And so at time of commitment, I think, hi Janice, that it can be doable and feasible for them in their world, but that you can't necessarily bank on that for the duration of a whole project.
Thank you so much, Michelle, Gail, and Sam, for sharing your experience. I know that it's right at 1 o'clock and people might have to jump to other meetings. I'm happy to stay for a couple more minutes, but Gail, Michelle, and Sam, thank you so much for sharing your expertise.
Thank you.
Thank
If
you.
I can stay on in case anyone does have any last questions, but yeah. Thank you for having.
I did drop in the chat a link to our Twitter recruitment for the simulation training if people want to develop further skills, and it's open to trainees and researchers and our youth and family partners as well.
Michelle, I felt that my master's ethics, the turnover time is just a bit slow for an engagement research. So I wonder, Gail, do you run into problems with, modifying your ethics in the middle of your projects?
You're talking about the ethics approval for a project?
Yes.
Oh, I don't know how much you want to hear about that. It took us a long, long time to get through ethics for this project. I definitely don't really have any tips. I think that it is an area, for example, where some of the questions that I had in the slides, these are questions that we may need to also be bringing forward to REB boards, because the way that we're trying to engage with people is a bit different. And as we try and change that, it does sometimes create tensions with sort of, what are the current conventions in terms of how to think about people's involvement in research. I'll give one quick example would be, we have not quite crossed this bridge yet, but most of the participant collaborators in our project would like to be publicly known. They are collaborating, and in some parts of the world that happens much more often, and maybe some of you know about cases where, like research where that has happened. Because my work is with young people, it's that extra layer. So young people, labeled, disabled, all of the discussions about vulnerability get in the way. And it can be difficult to advocate for why a young person might say, I'm really proud of my contribution and I want to be able to receive credit for that. I don't want somebody telling me that I have to be protected. So we have written in that we will visit that with our participant collaborators. So it's not blocked by our ethics, but we will have to revisit, making sure that we definitely are not in any kind of conflict with the REB at whatever point that we move to becoming more public. It's a really tough one to think through.
Can I just add, just even prior to the ethics, and I don't know whether you thought about this, but when we submitted a grant and had 3 pediatric investigators listed as co-applicants, we actually had a specific discussion with them that if the grant was funded, that their names would actually be on the CIHR website, and made sure that they were okay with that. So that's even before you even hit ethics. So I don't know if you have any comments on that.
I guess the only thing I would want to add, or like what comes to mind most, is, we are a group of qualitative researchers, and we're trying to be as reflexive as we possibly can. So there are, I can't even think about how I would tell you all of the times where we've run into, oh, this is how we usually do it, but here, oh, I think we need to do it differently now. Even things like, we've had some preliminary analysis. We will work together with the young people to work on some aspects of analysis together. But I would say, like, the layers that are, for me, like deeply ingrained in terms of how we are meant to interact with research participants versus young people who are also collaborating in a study are very messy. Like, do you need to use a pseudonym in a transcript? Do you need to de-identify in the team when you talk about, even though, like, we know who the young people are? So even for us, there are some interesting things. When I say it out loud like that, maybe it makes it sound like, well, isn't that easy? But actually it is pretty complicated because we're challenging our own norms as well in terms of how do we both respect the research process, but come to terms with that. We have very purposefully designed this so that participants in the study are also very much collaborating with us. For me as an interviewer, I can't begin to tell you how challenging it has been to try to not interview the young people, because I'm meant to be learning from them, talking to them about the project, working together on developing this training module. So it is not meant to be an interview.
I think it's challenging, Gail, because there's really clear ethical guidelines for participants.
Yeah.
There is almost no ethical guidelines for patient partners, and yet they bring their lived experience. It's like data, but it goes in meeting notes. There's no like, do you de-identify it? Same with you, Melissa. Like, we put our patient partners on our website as featured members of our team? We do it with all the researchers, but then we're outing them as people with a particular set of lived experiences. Do you want everyone knowing that about them? Like, it's really complicated.
It is. It's very complicated. And as I said, we might be able to learn some things if we look to countries where like UK is basically a good example, where they've been doing often called citizen engagement or public engagement, slightly different terms than us. And I think you do see lots of open, very public acknowledgement of partnerships with past patients. They use, again, different language. There's a bit less comfort here, and I think that makes it harder for us as well. Because for me, it's not that I think I know what the right way is, but I'm blocked from doing it. It is truly that I'm not really quite sure. So we have to continually talk about it, think about it, confront it. Simple things like when I say the team, who am I including in that team? How can I give the talk I just gave and not include the young people in the team slide? But they're not included in the slide because we're not at the point where we could do that, and we don't know that we will get there. It depends, because we will have to really take a lot of time to try to make sure they understand all of what that would mean. So it has been part of the discussions that we have had with young people. But I think it's also very exciting. So again, yeah, I think a lot of us share the commitment to doing the work, but it's also about how to find a way that makes sense. I will say, so Jennifer Johannesson, who is one of the co-hosts of that podcast, I've frequently heard her say that she continues to find it shocking that, as Michelle said, we have endless guidelines about how patients would participate in research, and we have next to none for how we can actually do this thing partnering with. And so that's really what I'm talking about when I say terms of engagement. As with most research, I think our results are likely going to be like, it'll be a step, it'll be a contribution towards this, but I think we're all trying to think about this and move forward. And there is, I'm not sure if it was on one of your slides, Michelle, but CIHR does have a new publication, which was, as far as I know, it was authored by some of the top people who have been patient advisors to CIHR for quite a long time. I haven't got my hands on that book yet, but I'd like to, because it certainly would be a good guide to work from. And I mean, Sam, you will have lots of experience with this being a special interest of yours. There are good resources, but I think that we don't have much agreement yet. There's still just a bit of everything out there. It's hard to pull it together.
Amanda, yeah.
I have a question about, so ideally, we're co-constructing the research questions together. However, applying for grants for the funding then requires a lot of time and effort from the researcher and the patient partner, or, I mean, a lot of work in autism. And so, I mean, my mindset is that because of the heterogeneity of the autism spectrum condition, you also need to have multiple perspectives. So then you have multiple people coming in to co-develop the research questions and the ideas and the project and the proposal. And I mean, I don't have access to that kind of funding up front, and that I imagine like many students who are going through aren't going to have that. I wonder if there's any sort of guidelines or, I don't know, solutions or ideas for kind of tackling some of those challenges up front. Probably not, but.
One of the ways that I've seen people use, and I used myself for this current project, that this also goes to like the long time frame, at least for now. I would say it was at least 4 years ago, but maybe more. To get started with this project, I went and talked to the Youth Advisory Council at Holland Bloorview, which was, I already had associations there, to share the idea and see what the young people had to say about this, whether they thought that it was important. Again, I think a person could be, you know, I could have done that in a different way. I brought an idea essentially. So like, it's still a little bit of like planting a seed, saying, what do you think of this idea? It's not, I know some groups start almost from scratch in terms of like, what are your priorities? But I think more institutions are bringing together family advisory groups and youth advisory groups and so on, who do spend time themselves working on like what might be important priorities. One of my students, for example, is doing work on how young people understand and develop strategies for coping with pain. And her work is building on the work of another Canadian researcher who did kind of a consensus project with young people who have chronic pain to identify what are some priorities for research. And that was the whole point of that one project. So to me, again, I'm throwing it out as an idea. I'm not sure it's a perfect idea, but I think the other thing is, if we have respect for this resource, instead of going back to the drawing board every single time, maybe there is a rationale for building on different types of activities where people have consulted, where families or young people, or like, again, whatever the group is, have identified priorities and picking up some of those. So again, maybe we don't ourselves have to do all that work with people, but we are mindful and respond to what priorities have already been identified, and how could we build on some of those? Maybe that's one way. And as you say, it would be more feasible, but I ended up having to have 3 consultations over about 1.5 years before I got the go ahead from that group. So I don't mean to be sounding like I'm complaining about that. I'm just saying, hey, like that's again, like it all takes a lot of time.
The other thing I've recently done is work with existing partners. So you don't have to reach out to new people and build that trusting relationship. So if you have any existing partners, it can be, you know, maybe rolled into the grant that they are already on, or some other way to compensate their work, or they hold a paid role with an agency or organization where consulting is a part of their role. The other thing I did this recent round was there was a partner who was interested in working with me, and I was really just transparent and saying, like, I'm happy to rope you in at these early stages when we're discussing the ideas. I can't pay for this work because we're putting the grant together, but I will pay you. We'll build in funding for you if we're funded to allow you to continue your role in a paid way. And they were really pleased with that. I don't think it'll work in every time. I think it's case by case, but that's what we're trying this go around.
Can I just make a comment about the Youth Advisory Council? I know we're way over time, but this is, this is a great topic, and it's so topical, and will be in the years to come. But I found it very interesting that Gail mentioned the Youth Advisory Council, because I know we actually, for a number of years, have had a relationship with the Youth Advisory Council. But one of the things we were very sensitive to when we were interested in potentially inviting more engagement was that the Youth Advisory Council has a separate role. Like their role is not to facilitate research for researchers. They're not kind of a resource to tap. They're kind of a forum for the youth to discuss their concerns, et cetera, et cetera. At least that's the way at McMaster. So we were very sensitive about, there's a liaison to the Youth Advisory Council. Like we didn't simply just approach them directly, and it would be, I think, inappropriate for a group to try and do that. So we went through the liaison, we had an existing relationship and said, you know, this is what we're thinking. We're wondering if you can present this as, you know, to the group independent of us. Is this something they would like to hear about? You know, and if the answer is yes, then we can share more information. If the answer is no, then that's kind of their prerogative. But it is kind of a sensitive issue not to turn that forum that's kind of a safe haven for the youth into something that's treated more like a resource for researchers. So I don't know if there's any comments on that.
I think that's pretty common, and it describes my best understanding of events at Holland Bloorview as well. They've had a Youth Advisory Council for a long time. They have the same kind of no liaison. So I certainly couldn't just directly approach the Youth Advisory Group. I needed to be scheduled in and, again, like follow their process. But they make it very, very clear. And like an example would be, I guess there might have been a history where people were trying to use the Youth Advisory Council also as like sort of a vehicle for recruitment for studies and some of these kinds of things. So I think one of the things, like to me, what I learned from that is it points out how quickly and how easily when we bring together something like, say, a youth advisory or a family advisory, we're not always aware of like how many other asks suddenly all come to them. And then they quickly do have this kind of pushback maybe, or like however we would describe it, like try to set some boundaries. And I think that makes sense. Like it's totally makes sense that they would do that. And it points out to me how, yeah, like I feel, and I shouldn't say we, but as a researcher, I'm not aware of all those things. Like I would not have that information. And that tells me that, yeah, like again, it's a bit of a, well, maybe this is too critical of a term, but in a sense, awareness and respect for the fact that from their perspective, it can feel like a free-for-all. Like they can feel like once they step up, then everybody's like, oh, you know, like that young person is so well-spoken and, you know, does such a good job of telling the story. And we know that like right now we're all being told, get those stories out there because they're so powerful, and they are. But it often ends up, that's what Veronica writes about, like everybody wanted a piece of her is how it felt in the end, until that she felt that there wasn't anything left. And she would go to conferences and be invited to be a keynote, like it just carried on and it got beyond, like she was sort of a star in the mental health advisory world. And it was very, very damaging to her until she sort of finally was able to tune into it and needed to step back entirely. So she writes so beautifully about her own perspective. I feel like I've learned a lot from reading her work. But again, there's lots of that kind of commentary out there for us. I don't think it means we have to stop. I just think it means we have to really, you know, be kind of humble about how we tackle things, and really, like all of you have said, keep asking those questions all the time so that we're not, whether we have good intentions or not, doesn't matter, right? That we're not taking advantage. And I think that it is pretty challenging. I feel the lure myself when a young person is so well spoken and is expressing something that I would really like to get across through my research. It's hard to not just jump all over that.
I am supposed to be facilitating this, and I really wanted to thank Michelle, Gail, and Sam for your time. I'm sure you'll be reachable by email if there are further questions. And I wanted to say thank you on behalf of all CCHCSP for today's presentation.